start out asking you about something that you just mentioned in your presentation, which is, I guess, some of the economic changes, some of the effects on markets that we're seeing right now because of COVID. I know you've been doing quite a bit of work on the effect that this has had on women, and you touched on that, but I would love to hear a little bit more about what you found when you looked into how particularly this pandemic has affected women in the workplace.
Yeah, so women really have been hit like with a double whammy with this pandemic. And I think, so let's start with the first, which was at the start of the pandemic, it's women whose industries were hit the hardest. And if you stop and think about it, it's who got hit hard? Anybody who does in-person care, what kinds, in-person work, what kinds of jobs require you interacting with another human being? Well, those are some kind of caregiving service job, right? It may be care as in medical care. So we saw a lot of non-essential medical care shut down. It could be care as in, personally helping you make a purchase in the store, or care as in cutting your hair, or care as in some other kind of personal service. All those things were what got shut down. In every one of those industries, women held the majority of jobs. So they really saw themselves more likely to get laid off at the beginning of the pandemic. So that has meant that as we've seen recalls and a lot of those layoffs, women have been, gotten more of the bulk of the recalls. That's because they have the bulk of the layoffs. But while that's been going on, we also saw that, it wasn't just the people who got sent home from work, but it was the kids who got sent home from school and from daycare and from childcare. So you had the women who were able to work at home. If you had kids, you were working at home while you and your partner were trying to work out childcare. And I think the thing that this pandemic has exposed is what I would call an incomplete revolution for women in terms of gender equity in the home. So, we've made a lot of progress. We've seen, over the last 30 or 40 years, men do more housework than they used to. They do more childcare. They're much more involved parents. We also know that it wasn't 50-50. And one of the ways in which we all dealt with that was that, there was a lot of outsourcing. A professional teacher educated your child, for instance. Professional caregivers might take care of them after school. You may have, ordered a lot of your meals through takeout. You may have hired house cleaners to help with the cleaning. There were a lot of ways in which you used services to make up for that, not quite 50-50. And what that did was, shrunk the amount of work that needed to be done. And then when women were doing the big half, it was the big half of something that was smaller. COVID made that thing bigger, and women are doing the big half. So now we're doing the big half of a big thing. And I think that has, what has that meant? Well, that's meant in households where people have cut back on hours or even left their job or not gone back to work when they were recalled. It's been disproportionately falling on women. The stress and anxiety of managing, educating kids at home has disproportionately fallen on women. All parents are suffering. This isn't really to downplay what's happening to men, but just to say that this is really, it's magnifying a gender gap that was already there. And I think on the plus side, it's highlighting for the entire country that childcare is actually an essential part of the economy. One of the statistics I highlighted in that presentation, manufacturers are now saying that the number one problem to bringing workers back is they can't come into the factory because they're at home with their kids. It's not a nice to have. It's part of the infrastructure of a modern economy that allows parents to work.
Well, and also maybe like the free market has not maybe properly priced or valued childcare in the economy. It's been maybe a little bit undervalued. Is that fair? Or
I think there is this like natural question of why should government provide any education, at all? And then why childcare or early childhood education? Why were we waiting till 5 and then having the government in? So it raises this whole big question of what's the role for government. And I think that if we think about it as a problem in credit markets, like why don't you borrow to pay for this childcare when you've got kids that are young? It's actually really hard. It's probably easier to say, it is easier to save for college than it is to save for childcare, because you have 18 years after the kid's born to save for college. But some people are very organized and spend years planning that first child.
Nobody spends 20 years saving for childcare.
But they usually aren't spending 20. They're not, and many people, half of pregnancies are not planned. So most people are not preparing that fully. And so you find out you're pregnant, you have, 9 months, 4 months, depending on when you find out, to prepare for childcare, which costs as much as in-state college tuition. So it's a bigger problem for a lot of parents than college. And yet all of our attention seems to be on trying to fix the college problem so that we're not, saddling young people with college tuition and student loans. But at the same time, right, we don't even have a well-developed loan market for childcare. And, parents are forced in this situation where it's like, okay, well, what should maybe somebody stays home so we don't bear this expensive cost of childcare, but the cost to that in terms of the rest of your career is enormous. And that is another issue. And you might think it's a market failure problem, an information problem. Why is it that if women take 3 or 4 years out of the labor force, it's so hard for them to ever get back into where they were before? And that's, or it's a training issue, right? Like do you fall behind, right? So Stacey, you could think about in your job, like if you went away for 3 or 4 years, you'd come back, people would be doing things a little different, they'd be using different equipment. And yeah, you'd still have some skills, but you'd be behind. And who's gonna get you caught up, right? And that's why we see that when women take a lot of time out of the labor force, they can get really, depending on the field, they can get really, really hurt by it, and they'll never earn as much for the rest of their life. So they want to borrow to put their kids into childcare so they can stay in the workforce. But who lends them that money? So that's one argument for we want government involved. The other argument is high quality early childhood education is a gift that keeps on paying to the taxpayer, because those kids who get high quality early childhood education through center-based care tend to go on to earn more as adults, which means they pay more into the tax system, and they are less likely to have problems that cost the taxpayers money. So that's another reason that government should be involved. But you're absolutely right that the market seems to be a problem, and childcare workers are some of the lowest paid workers around.
I feel like what you're saying is sort of particularly concerning in light of some of the numbers that we've seen about women dropping out of the workforce or the workforce participation rate. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what we've seen in recent months and kind of what the implications are for the number of women dropping out of the workforce.
Yeah, so first of all, for prime age women, so that's women 25 to 54, the ages you think people are working, labor force participation for women's back where it was in the mid 80s. So like every time I stop and think about that, I'm like, it's 2020, and I feel like we just tumbled back in time all the way back to when my mother was, young and was in the
30
workforce.
years of progress lost in 8 months. I mean, that's pretty stunning.
Yes. And it actually, that's where it's recovered to, right? Like it had actually fallen to the early 80s. So it was like 40 years of progress lost. And the question is, how long will it take us to get that all back? And it really depends on how long it lasts. I think the thing that really shook everybody up was watching how big the fall was in September when the kids didn't go back to in-person school. I mean, maybe like it's 1 month of data. They always say, let's make sure we keep seeing this. Maybe the data overemphasized this point, but the decline in labor force participation was 4 times larger for women than it was for men. And it was almost a full percentage point. And that's why, like, it basically everything that we had made up from May through August just disappeared in terms of labor force participation. And it's definitely bleak, but kids will go back to school. And the question is, historically, women have been so penalized when they take time out that they don't go back as much because the benefits of going back have gotten smaller. One hopes that like there's going to be so many people with a COVID-sized hole on their resume that employers are going to be working really hard to try to reabsorb these women. But, you know, I think you're going to see a large number of women who this ends up defining their entire career.
Wow. I mean, and it also is not necessarily proportionately hitting all like races and socioeconomic classes equally, right? I mean, I feel like it could potentially exacerbate income differences and things like that, because a lot of times, you know, these decisions are made. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that drives me crazy is like, you know, you saw Congress back in, you know, June talking about, well, maybe the unemployment insurance checks are preventing people from going back to work. And I was like, hello, what about the lack of childcare? And so it is true that the unemployment insurance checks are probably helping people stay home, but they literally can't go because their kids are at home, and it's not legal to like leave your first grader at home doing first grade Zoom school while you go to work. And it's not safe or a good idea. It's not just about it being illegal. Like, what do you do if you are low income and you have the only way to earn a living is through in-person work? And so I mean, that's like the real conundrum a lot of families are facing. And I think, you know, I worry a lot about the really, you know, the not low income, but the single mother who worked hard to be able to get a well-paying, as in solid middle class paying nurse job or hospital job, that she's had to quit because she doesn't have access to childcare. And how will she get back into that work afterwards? But then, as you pointed out, for some women, they can't do that. So then they're relying on other people for childcare, or their children are in, you know, not the best situation. And so maybe the mothers stay in the workplace, but the kids are not really getting access to Zoom school because there's nobody to supervise them. They're staying home with a 15-year-old sibling who isn't really able to supervise fourth grader Zoom school. And so we're going to have a lot of learning gaps between, you know, some kids who are in more privileged households where their parents to help them out, and then kids whose families are struggling to keep it all together. It's a lot to ask a young child to manage their own learning with a teacher who's on the other side of a computer screen.
And access to devices and access to Wi-Fi. I mean, Betsey, you also have 2 young children. I mean, you've been living this. I don't know, what has it been like to look at the numbers? And also, I don't know, I'm curious about your own experiences, sort of parenting during the pandemic, trying to, you and your husband, Justin Wolfers, both economists, work full time.
So, I mean, we've definitely been more fortunate than most, which is we had a full-time nanny to begin with who used to be a teacher. So that's about as lucky as you could get in the pandemic. And during the worst parts, like during the shutdowns, she was laid off. So for most of the summer, you know, and the late spring, we didn't have help. And so I definitely lived that. And it's hard. And honestly, right now, I don't think I'd be able to juggle the work that I'm doing if I didn't have help with my kids managing their school at home. Like I just something would have had to have given up. And there was a point this summer where I was like, maybe I take a leave of absence, from work so that, because I'm teaching 3 classes this semester. Teaching 3 classes and managing your kids at Zoom is not possible. So, um, I or not possible to do well across all of them, right? And that, I think that's what's really hard. But you're also, as a parent of young kids, like I see that there's so many developmental aspects going on with the kids. They need so many resources. And I think they're going to be our long lasting impact of this. I was at a meeting recently where we were talking about the potential long-term impact on US productivity. This is one of these things, Stacey, where you're like, okay, that's like a number, maybe it gets reported on NPR, productivity rates came out today, and like normal people start tuning out. Well, what are we talking about? We're talking about whether the kids today are learning less and as a result are less effective in their jobs in 20 years because they just aren't as good at math, or they aren't as good at writing, or they aren't as good at storytelling when they graduate because they're not getting the same educational experience. And we can solve that problem by making it up to them. But I think we have to realize right now that these kids, it's not going to be like they go back to school maybe in March or February full time and we're past the pandemic and now everything's fine. They're going to need some catch up if we want to make sure that we leave those kids with the same human capital they would have had without the pandemic. And I think from a policy perspective, I think it's really important for policymakers to start to realize that these kids, we're not done with them when the pandemic ends. Like they got really shook up staying home, and we're going to need some dedicated effort to make sure that there's a human capital catch up.
And I'm wondering too, like as you're looking at I guess older students who are graduating, who are going into the job market, and speaking with teachers who are trying to advise students and help them out in this moment, I'm wondering if there's anything that you're noticing that might either be helpful to them or that you're noticing that you're worried about in regards to, I guess, older students who may not have like sort of developmental educational gap issues, but are potentially graduating into a really difficult situation.
Yeah, so I mean, research is pretty clear that it's really bad to graduate into a recession. And that could last with you for a really, really long time. And it's really unfortunate and frustrating because, again, it's sort of one of these things where you think the market should fix it. And I remember in 2011 saying to employers, if you go back and look at those people who graduated in 2008, 2009, there's a lot of really good ones that just missed opportunities. Why don't you hire them into your entry-level job? And they're probably better, than the best student you can get out of this class of 2011 that everybody's trying to hire. But it's just not how they think, particularly for college graduates, where there's this process where you go to the university and you decide you're hiring this year. And so we see these students, particularly college graduates, graduate into a recession and can just have scarring effects that last a long time. So one of my recommendations to young people is, now I know that education stinks right now. We're all doing it remotely. It's so much harder, but the best place to hide from a recession is in school. And it's much easier it's cheaper to get education today because the opportunity cost is lower. What you're going to give up is so much less. So, I mean, that is my advice, is to either get back into education now or think about heading back into education, in the very, very near term, so that you have a chance to re-graduate with a new degree when the economy is stronger.
I know, I think I was actually thinking about this because I believe that the last time I saw you in person was at the American Economics Association annual meeting when there are all the young graduates running around in suits, like from meeting to meeting to meeting interviewing. And I'm wondering if that will happen in January and how that job market will adjust.
Well, that's the job market for PhD economists. And yes, I think everybody's really stressed about it this year because it's not just a recession, but obviously universities have been hit pretty hard. Enrollment is down this fall. And a lot of universities have decided that they're not going to be hiring. And so it's like you've got somebody who's just finished a PhD in economics. There's going to be some job for them, but that dream job of, getting a tenure track position at a research university is going to be even harder than it normally is for people to land. And I think that is, that's something I think people are going to struggle with.
Well, sorry to just pop in. I enjoyed the conversation. I was like, I'm just going to do the webcam turn on thing, but we are at 5 o'clock. Thank you, Stacey Vanek Smith from NPR, Planet Money, Betsey Stevenson from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for that really enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Betsey. Good to see you.
Good to see you.